Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from Newcastle upon Tyne. I'm Richard D. Hall. This week's edition of the show is being filmed in front of a live audience, and the subject on the agenda is the financial crisis, otherwise known as the recession, the credit crunch, financial meltdown, economic downturn, or as I like to call it, the debt-based economy con. In mainstream media TV shows and debates, it is taken as a given that there is a huge debt which we must all deal with. But shouldn't the question be, why is there a debt to deal with in the first place? What is the real cause of this recession? Is the actual system flawed? And more conspiratorially, has the situation been engineered deliberately by those who control the banks? Here to discuss the subject and to try and answer some of these questions, I have with me Mark Cogging, who used to work in the banking sector and after leaving the industry has campaigned for radical changes to the current economic system, and Steve Campion, a chartered accountant and local businessman who runs a very successful travel and holiday company which has a significant internet presence. Also here to discuss the issues, we have a live audience, and unlike other mainstream television debates, we haven't planted any questions and we haven't handpicked or vetted any of the participants. So let's get the ball rolling. Does anyone have a burning question on the subject that I spoke of earlier, which is the economy? Would anyone like to start us off? Yes, sir. If you wait for the microphone to come to you.
What are we meant to do? Basically, if you talk about the banks and how it's all controlled, what as Joe Public are we meant to do in terms of
Okay.
what do you think, what are we meant to do to...
How do you overturn it?
How do you overturn it? Where do we start?
So your question's based on the assumption that there is something sinister going on. So
Definitely.
I think probably the person who would best deal with that one is Mark Cogging, because you've campaigned for many years to change the system.
Well, I think your presentation earlier was excellent. The first thing you can do is, as I guess you have already, is wake up to what's actually going on. It comes over quite complex. People, whenever you talk about finance to people, it's like, boom, just switch off. But what you saw there is the easiest, simplest concept in the world to grasp. And that causes you to feel bloody stupid that you've been so blind to something so obvious. All you can do is just tell other people to start with. But I've campaigned for a number of years because I believe there is a solution to this. I heard someone in the audience earlier saying that the only way out of this is a violent, bloody revolution. If you look around you now, the world's falling apart and you've got violent, bloody revolutions going on everywhere. So that's one option. But it's not going to get you too far. There is something else can be done, but I think we'll probably come back to that a little bit later, but it's about being aware to start with.
I'll just interject there. Now, a lot of people have done very well over the last 10, 20 years, and your business, Steve, is highly successful. So for all we're in a recession, you know, people still have a lot of wealth. I mean, do you think you would be in a much better situation if there hadn't been a recession? Do you see it the same way?
I think the recession is hurting most businesses as well as individuals. There is the possible exception that and even the banks have probably suffered in terms of their profits, albeit the bankers, the people that work in the banks, there is an argument, haven't suffered at all. I think to the danger of the system, that there are clearly inherent weaknesses in the current system, which has led to the financial collapse. The problem is correcting it isn't as straightforward as it may seem, because we have already built up a financial and economic system that relies on the system that we now have. Probably the best example of that is if you look at the fractional reserve system, every £1,000 or so that's deposited, through Richard's presentation, he explained that can lead to an enormous amount of money in the economy. The problem is if you abolish the fractional reserve system overnight, that money in the economy has to disappear. And the recession that we're actually now experiencing, particularly the financial pain that the majority of the public are now suffering, is in part because As a result of the financial crisis, we are already scaling back that fractional accounting system. The reserves that the banks now have to hold have been increased, and actually their mechanism to actually build up their capital to deal with that has been that they've just stopped lending money to anybody. And that is what causes, or that is part of the reason why we cause the pain. The problem is if you abolish that system overnight, the pain that would be suffered in the short term would be immense. So if you want, my view would be, if you want to move away from the fractional reserve system, you have to do it in a controlled and steady basis. You can't just abolish it overnight.
So you're not necessarily disputing the fact that there isn't a better way. You're just saying that you're questioning how on earth would you move to a different system.
In part, but I think I would also question the simplicity of abolishing interest. Interest is something that's inherent in our system. To use your example where you said if you abolished all the current money in the system and you lent £10 or you gave £10 to every member in this room, if we then said, right, we're all going to sell a piece of jewellery, what would happen in the room is that one or two pieces of jewellery would be a lot more attractive to a large number of people than some other pieces of jewellery. And as a result of that, a number of people in the room would be prepared to pay a lot more than the initial amount of money they'd been given for those pieces of jewellery. They'd only be able to do that by borrowing money from somebody else in the audience. Now, those people that lend them that money, if they're their best friend and they inherently trust them, then they will lend them that money and perhaps rely on them paying it back. But if they've never ever met them before and they live in a different part of the country, they're only going to lend them that money if they're going to get a promise that they're going to get something in return. And interest is almost a reflection of human behaviour, and it's a measure of risk. If I went out now and said, I've got £700 to lend, anybody want to borrow £10, and I'd give £10 to every person in this audience now, it's human nature that I wouldn't get every one of those £10 back. And therefore, if I was to do that, I'd want to put some price on that. To probably explain that a bit further, if you're a business and you're setting up a business, the measure of interest is a measure of the risk. So if I said I'm now going to set up a software company, I have no experience of setting up software companies, but I've got an idea and I'm going to set up a software company and I want to borrow £350 from the audience based on the £10 that we've distributed to everybody. And Bill Gates stands up and says he wants to set up a software company and he wants to borrow £10 from every audience. And then you all then decide who you're going to lend the money to. You're all going to lend the money to Bill Gates and not to me. And the only way I'll get you to lend me any of that money is if I promise you a higher rate of interest than Bill Gates is prepared to pay you. So the interest is in the system to measure risk.
But if it was done centrally through a government, then the government could assess that risk and then loan it at zero interest, depending on whether that person's had good ability to pay. So in other words, it would be a service rather than an economic thing of demand and supply. So it would be something that everyone would have the right to do, and if they paid that money back, then they've got good creditworthy, so the government could then lend them more. So if we just take another question from the audience. Yes, sir, the white shirt.
Do you think the current economic crisis that we are suffering, allegedly, and also the enforced debts that Greece, Ireland and probably Portugal have to take on have been engineered?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you want to expand on that, Mark? Why would you say that's engineered?
How do you expand on such a vast subject in a forum like this? But absolutely. Here's how it was engineered. There you go. There's the Gaussian copula formula. That's how it was engineered. That goes past everyone. Yeah.
So what's that formula, Mark?
A guy called Lee. The facts might be a bit shady here, but he worked for Barclays in '94. Came from China originally. Mathematician, basically. This is all about risk, as Steve rightly pointed out. It's about assessing risk, pricing the risk, assessing if the value of, if the person who owns this house becomes unemployed, what's the chances of the people in their street becoming unemployed? How do you link those risks together? you can't actually do it. You get chaos. So what this formula actually did was to overcome all of those many different variables in an economy, millions of them, by, well, just overcoming them. It's actually the biggest con trick in history, this is. So it boils down to the question, did the guy who wrote the formula know what he was doing, or was it used by other people to bring the economy down? But on the basis of this, and it was used by the city, and if anyone actually wants to Google the Gaussian copula formula, you'll see it's been discussed in the mainstream press very much. It was this that allowed the sale of derivatives that actually caused what became known as the credit crunch. Now, ironically, the guy who came up with this formula was then very swiftly flew off back to his country of origin, which is China. China today, as you know, is the most rapidly growing economy in the world. I wonder if anyone knows why that is. It's because they issue their own currency, debt-free.
Now, you mentioned derivatives there, Mark, and I did try and explain it in my own simple way in the talk. But where do you stand on derivatives, Steve? I mean, do you think they're fundamentally wrong, or do you think they have a place in an economy?
I think derivatives are dangerous, partly because they become very complicated, and the basic derivatives initially start out as fairly understandable products, but then they become more and more complicated as people start trading them, and then you get effectively derivatives of derivatives. And people then stop, it almost becomes very difficult to get your head around what these products actually are. And I think one of the problems with the financial crisis is the bankers convinced themselves that these products were so clever that they couldn't lose money.
And they couldn't with that formula. That's why it happened. They couldn't lose money. They were making billions.
But would you not concede that anyone who works in these types of speculation and banking aren't adding any real wealth to an economy because they're not producing their job?
I would agree that they don't create wealth. They facilitate the transfer of funds between depositors and lenders.
Okay. So if they don't create wealth, would you argue that sector should be, the intention should be to make it as small as possible, and we spend as little effort as possible? Because the more people make money out of doing nothing, the worse it is in effect for the economy. Okay.
I think the money that the bankers make is clearly disproportionate to the value they add to society.
Right.
And I think that's probably shared by the majority of the public. The difficulty we have as members of the public, and clearly the government as well, is just no matter how hard they try now, the banks have become so powerful that actually scaling back the power that the banks have is proving to be a large challenge. And even though the intention of in the UK, the last government and the current government, the coalition government, has been to try and control the banks, try and reduce their bonuses and try and reduce their influence, it's proving remarkably difficult because they've already got themselves into a position where they control so much of society in their ability to determine where funds are lent, who they're lent to, and what rate of interest they choose to charge for those.
Can we have another question, Mark?
If you wish.
Can
I round that last question off with
quickly, and then we'll have
with
a
something? The modern banking system creates money out of nothing. And the process is the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. And if you want to be slaves to the bankers and pay the costs of your own slavery, then let the banks create money. Now, who just said that? I didn't. That comes from a former director of the Bank of England, Lord Josiah Stamp.
And we all know that most energy is produced from oil. Now, everyone has seen these rising petrol prices, as well as domestic energy prices. Do you have a comment on that, Mark? I mean, why does a barrel of oil cost this, and then what we pay at the pump is, so many times more?
Because the people who take the oil out of the ground and put it into barrels gather together, OPEC, and decide whether they're going, how much they're going to charge us. Pick a number out of the air. What's going on here? And it's hard for people to accept, but it's quite trackable, it's quite provable. Give me 10 minutes on Newsnight and this country would change because people would actually discover what's going on. The people who literally own the oil companies are the same bankers we're talking about. Not a group of people as such. These are corporations. They have a plan. And what you're witnessing around the world today, these countries collapsing, coups, revolutions, peaceful or otherwise, have all been engineered, and don't lose sight of the fact that they all triggered from one event, and that was an economic collapse globally. That economic collapse was engineered deliberately to create the kind of discussions that we're having today. Scrapping bankers' bonuses and all this is just fodder for the public to get stewed up about. Everyone thinks, yeah, scrap their bonuses. Of course they should be scrapped, but it's irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. The banking system can be reformed within 7 years. Interest can be scrapped, inflation can be got rid of, and quite honestly, income tax can be abolished within 7 years as well, at least down to 50% of what it is. These are facts, and your government doesn't want you to know about them.
Where do you stand on oil, Steve? I mean, are you getting annoyed with how much you put in your car?
I think we probably all have to accept that oil prices are going to continue to rise. Oil is a scarce resource. It's a limited. The Earth only has a limited amount of oil.
That's actually debatable.
Well,
I interviewed a guy called Ian Crane the other day who reckons that the Russians have dug 5-mile deep wells and they're not even convinced this oil comes from plants and dead animals. That there's this abiotic oil and there's actually a pretty much limited supply. But that's another subject altogether.
well, I would suspect even if they found sources of oil that we're not aware of, it's still probably going to be a limited commodity. And we have a society which is at the moment is largely dependent on oil. We also have a population in the world that is continuing to grow. There's 6 billion people now in the world, and there's no sign of that falling off. The developing world in China, in India, in Brazil, and other countries, as they industrialize and as the standard of living in those countries improves, their uptake and use of oil is going to vastly increase, and therefore you've got increasing demand for oil, and oil is a commodity which is probably in limited supply, and therefore inevitably it's going to increase in price. Obviously in the UK oil is taxed in terms of petrol, diesel, etc., and a large amount of what we pay is still in the form of tax when we buy oil, but the likelihood is the ability of the governments going forward to continue to tax oil at the rate they do will diminish, because the actual wholesale price of oil, as in the price per barrel, will continue to rise.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, gentlemen.
Have you seen the recent Zeitgeist movie, Moving Forward? And what are your feelings towards, if so, what are your feelings towards the Venus Project and its cashless society and its resource-based economy?
All right. I mean, I've seen the previous Zeitgeist film. I would imagine you've seen the Zeitgeist film, and probably you haven't, Steve.
No.
Right, okay. Do you want to make a comment on the Venus Project? Because, I mean, I can give you my comment. It just all seems massively idealistic, the Venus Project. I mean, Steve was saying that how do you get from the situation or the system that we're in to this system that Mark and I are trying to describe? You know, how do you get from there to there? It seems to me that the Venus Project is even a further step down the kind of fantasy. I don't wish to poo-poo it, but...
I do. At a time of global revolution, when you are being conned, they're creating a movie around you at the minute and telling you what to think about it. Now, I know Peter Joseph is a great guy. Good friends of mine know him personally and vouch for him. So in no way am I reflecting upon his character. The Venus Project seems to have latched onto an awful lot that Peter Joseph has been saying. Sorry, it was you who asked the question, wasn't it? And that and many other such schemes are around, as Richard pointed out, very idealistic. but will not solve a thing. If the economy collapsed tomorrow and we go back to the Stone Age, the Venus Project might be a good starting point. What I'm saying is we don't have to go back to the bloody Stone Age, but we've got to wake up quickly to this.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I think the Venus Project, you don't have any money at all.
You
Is
don't
that,
have, that's
it's
right.
a system without money.
Any system that it was money and still will be money, the exchange method by which we exchange energy, goods and services between ourselves, uncorrupted by these banksters, is the way ahead, is the way it always should have been and the way hopefully it will be in the future. It is the balancing principle. Without that, you can't have civilization, you can't have exchange of goods. It's great to barter, but it doesn't happen over great distance.
Okay.
So
I'm
the
just
Venus
gonna,
Project, very idealistic.
I'm going to throw
Nonsense.
something into the pot here, which I think it was Lee Evans, the comedian, said, who owns the Bank of England? And the answer was given, well, the government owes it. Well, why doesn't the government write off the money that it owes it? Could we just write off this £1,000 billion debt?
Yes.
If the government said, right, we're going to scrap the contract with the Bank of England, we're going to get rid of you, we've got our own money-making press, or...
Yes, we could. Tomorrow.
So what would be the... If we did that, you know, because in my talk I said it's £40,000 per household, the government debt. So you could just, written off, gone.
Yeah.
You think you can?
Well,
Would would there not be some net impact?
there would be a massive impact. The institutions that would collapse would be the very institutions we're talking about not wanting in the first place. That would reflect on to... You'd have pain. It would last about 7 years. This is an economic collapse that we're into, and it's only just beginning. So yes, there would be pain, but you're going to get the pain anyway. There's a far better way out of this, and it's to wake up to who's doing this and why. And it's actually quite simple, as many of you hopefully tonight have seen. The banking scam is very simple. That's what hides it from you.
All right. Any other questions?
I would like to come in on that. I think you could write it off, but there would be some pain. And the biggest problem we have is that this country, its current debt stands at about £1 trillion, but it's actually currently borrowing. Its current rate of borrowing this year, I think it's going to be £140 billion. If you write off the debt you owe, that debt is actually owed to people. Some of it is actually owed to you and I. Anybody who has a pension, whether it be a private pension or some of the public sector pensions, some of that money is invested in government bonds. And depending on which pension scheme you're in, the amount is. So if the government say, we're not going to pay that debt, we're not going to pay that debt, suddenly the value of your pensions are all going to fall, or anybody who's invested in that. A large amount of that debt is held by other foreign states. China is actually the largest one. The first thing you do if you don't pay it back is they will stop lending you any more money. So the government can't issue any more bonds. So we then have to find out, well, how do we actually pay for the services that we currently want? If we want to borrow £140 billion this year, nobody is going to lend the money to the government. If they write off...
Why can't the government just print that money rather than borrow
because that just inflates the cost of goods. As you explained, if you double the amount of money in circulation...
But borrowing it does the same, does it not?
But it doesn't inflate the cost of goods if the issuance of that currency is based upon the goods and services exchanged within the economy that we're talking about. The current system is a closed system. Anyone who's into physics will understand a closed system. What Richard has been talking about earlier, where you scrap the current system and have the issuance of the currency issued by and nationalised, and I mean that as in owned by us, not in any socialist way at all, because it's socialism, the myth of socialism that lies behind what's going on. If that were to change tomorrow, as I say, inflation is removed, so you don't need your interest because you're not battling uphill all the time anyway. Yes, there's going to be grief and there's going to be a lot of ripples coming out of this, but 7 years down the line, it was stabilized. We issue our own currency. The greatest losses would be incurred by those who have fraudulently loaned this money in the first place.
I would argue that we're not working in a closed system. We actually purchase a large amount of our goods from China. So if we say to them, we're not going to pay you the money back that we owe you, they'll stop sending us their goods. And if we print money to eliminate the debt, all they do is the price of the goods we import from China double in price. So if the whole of the UK are happy to go without their computers and their mobile phones, a lot of their clothing, and rely on what we manufacture at the moment in the UK,
But they're about to.
Well, has anybody in this room got a mobile phone that was manufactured in the UK?
Just talking about the Chinese, how they, you know, they don't have any debt, they don't have the problems that we have. Does that mean that we're always going to be in debt to China because they're the ones that are going to, you know, ultimately we're going to have to buy things from China? So we don't, is it not just a continuous cycle where China is just going to grow and grow and grow? Do you know?
Well,
Yes, it is. If I can answer, can I?
Yep, sure.
Yeah, it is going to be a continuous cycle because although China issue their currency debt-free as a nation, it's not really for the benefit.
You mentioned China 2 or 3 times here, so is that the only nation that
No,
that
no.
are sort of in that position where we have to,
No.
Are
What,
these
what,
you know,
what,
pander to them,
what you
if you
have
like?
with China is the people behind this have transferred their, well, China is their model economy.
yeah.
But this benefit that should come out of issuing the currency debt-free is not being used for the benefit of the people. It will be used for the benefit of an elite that will develop within China and already is. But that is, some of you will have heard the phrase the New World Order. I don't like using that, but it is. These people have set up China to do this, so now the West is in massive decline. It's no coincidence you've got documentaries on television called The End of the West and all this right now. This is what's happening. We're destined for this.
Are these two separate issues then? Yes, China has worked very hard to sell us all their goods and therefore they have our pounds and they have lots of dollars. Is this a separate issue to whether usury and interest and fractional reserve is correct? Do you see what I'm getting at? Are these two separate issues?
This is they are combined, but China's been mentioned. I mentioned Lee, the writer of the formula earlier, worked for Barclays, etc., worked for the National Bank of Canada, I forget the name. After the collapse, which his formula caused, he went back to China. But do you know what job he has in China? He's running China's risk assessment. He is the man running their economy on the risk assessment side. So either by sheer chance or not, this fella came over here, influenced the city here, and because the city's so bloody greedy, all the bloody yuppies and everything were just making billions out of this, whole system collapses, back he goes, running China's massively growing economy. Now, wake up, is this chance? I'm called a conspiracy theorist, usually by coincidence theorists, who I'm tired of nowadays. They're so thick.
I think we need to reflect. I think one of the things that Richard said in his presentation was if we abolish this usury system and fractional reserve banking, could we all achieve the same standard of living by working 25 hours a week instead of the current average of 40 or 45 or whatever it really is? I think where we have to look at is that in a very short period of time under this fractional reserve system, which probably has evolved over the last 200 or 300 years, in the 1800s, the average person started work at about the age of 11 or 12, received almost no education whatsoever. Life expectancies were around 40, 45. There was no annual holidays to speak of, and the average working hours a week were about 60. If you actually look at where we are now, we've advanced a fairly dramatic amount in that 200 years. And yet, because we're now suffering a little bit of pain because we're going backwards, and I think we are going backwards, and partly because we've over-borrowed as a result of the fractional reserve system. But I think to say that the whole system is a disaster because we're now going through what you would call a correction. If you actually think about how much we've progressed in 200 years, in comparison to some of the other industries, other countries in the world, for example, China, which at the beginning of this century was miles behind us in terms of standard of living, they're catching up, they're still behind us. So is it right that we blame this system and say it's been a disaster? Because in fact, it's actually seen in the last 200 years, it's driven a massive increase in the average standard of everybody's living.
But I would argue that we would all be even more well off if the wealth that people who work in the banking industry didn't take more than their fair share, and if they were working as part of the public sector, all that wealth would remain with the people. And there's two things you can go after that. You can either become richer or work less hours. And I'm an advocate of that that people should enrich their lives by having more time to themselves rather than trying to get 3 cars or 2 houses. But that's my own
Again,
personal...
if I may, this is sort of getting complexified because you don't need these peripheral discussions at all. It all does come down to the fact that the currency is issued by a private person or persons as a debt to you. The national debt figure was mentioned by Steve 10 minutes ago. I'd say that's entirely fictitious because the national debt is indeed every penny that was ever spent in this country. That's how much is owed because it was loaned to it. And that's why it can't be repaid.
Gentleman at the very back who hasn't spoken.
I want to know why debt agencies, debt charities and things like that don't make debtors aware of the double billing law.
Because they
Could
can't.
you explain why?
I'm not aware of that. Do either of you guys know what he's talking about?
No, sorry.
Well, do you want us to explain what the double billing law is?
Yeah, sure.
Right. If you have a bank loan with the bank and you renege on that, what they do is they sell your debt onto a debt agency who want to recover that debt. Right. Now what they've done is the bank's already claimed on the insurance on that loan, so they've getting their money. They've also sold that debt to a debt agency who want to recover your money. But what debtors don't know is that once they've sold that debt to the debt agency, you have no legal binding contract to actually pay that debt company recovering money any money.
Okay, yeah, Mark?
Well, from direct experience, when I got out of the industry I was in because I knew it was coming down, I did 2 years of debt collection, 3 years actually, part of which I love the irony of doing it. I went round a lot of these these people who were in debt, and it took the company I was working with about 18 months to realise that in fact I wasn't collecting their debts, I was explaining to them exactly what you were doing. When the debt is sold to a debt collection company, there is no contract between that company and you, and therefore there is no debt at law. The second you acknowledge that debt to them, you are bound by it.
So why don't debt agencies...
Well, you've answered your own question. They don't tell people that because...
charities are supposed to help you with debt.
Oh, because they're...
Are you saying why don't charities...
Not the banks, those banks...
Well, because the charities haven't got a clue either. They're born within the system.
They're supposed to be helping you.
Well, of course, charities are supposed to help everyone, but what do they actually do? They appoint directors on 180 grand a year.
So,
You know,
actually, once your debt's handed over to a debt agency, that debt doesn't exist.
yeah, if anyone in this room has a debt to a debt collection agency, it can be written off tomorrow, unless you've actually acknowledged it to them.
Right,
Yeah.
we'll come to you. You've already asked a question. We'll come to you next. We'll take someone who hasn't asked a question. Yes, sir.
What about Guernsey? I believe that used to issue 100% of its money supply to the government. I don't know whether it still does because it's a bit secretive. But the only tax there is 20% income tax, I believe.
Yeah. But the people who run this system have to have nice islands in sunny places to bugger off to, while they take the piss out of everyone else, if you pardon the language.
But do you think
that's what
do you think the government still issue the money there?
Sorry?
Do you think the government issue the money there? They're so wealthy anyway, they don't bother with that anymore. Because they used to. You probably know that, don't you?
They used to. Throughout history, there's been a battle, and that battle has actually created the world wars that you've seen and just about every other
I know. It's big business,
grief
isn't it?
that has happened. And the battle has always been between two monetary systems. The two systems where money is created by a private monopoly in limited supply, an interest debt note, or where money is created as a receipt for goods and services and is debt-free. That's based upon the production, the gross national product of a country. And new money is not poured into that system unless it's actually growing and developing the system. The current system that we have is a private monopoly issuing the currency as a debt. And when people get confused about this, whether it's Guernsey or any other country, I say that let's just imagine that you are the government of your country, be it Guernsey or anywhere, and you have to pay pensions, you have to put on bus services, trains, whatever. You may want private companies to run them, but the problem with that is they're greedy, and we all see what happens. Train companies, we know the way it goes. The other option, so what they do is borrow the money off of a private group of people to fund all of that. Well, tomorrow you could choose not to do that. You could print your own money debt-free. And the fact that our government allows us to do that shows that they're complicit to the crime.
Well, it's a 97% privatised money supply we have, don't we? It's
Sorry, I didn't hear.
97% of the money supply is privatised. It's private.
Yes, yes.
Probably going back to what the guys to my right said about what can we actually do about it. Now, I work for a company 40 hours a week, and at the end of the month I get paid into my bank account. What can I do to stop giving the banks the power by having my money in their account, or my account in their account at the end of the month? Could I turn around to my company and say, I don't want to put my money into that bank account, I want it in cash? Basically, what can we do about it? If everybody in this room turned around and say, I want cash, I don't want the money going into my account because this is giving the banks power. What can we do about it?
Project in a place called Totnes, where they invented the Totnes pound. So it was a currency that they invented, and this woman or team of people went around the market saying, look, will you buy this Totnes pound off me for £1? And they put this other currency into the system, which wasn't, and then I'm not quite sure what happened, but I think what may have happened is that the Totnes pound become worth more than the normal pound. Don't quote me on that, I'm not sure that that's what happened. But the other systems such as people doing favours for each other, like if you know a painter and decorator and he decorates your house and then you can then do him a favour, whatever. So you're getting money out of the system there. Can the people create their own currency, something that everyone could accept, and stop using the stuff that the Bank of England produces by pressing a button on a computer?
Yes.
Could people do that?
Yes.
Surely, at the end of the month, with me just going along with it, I just accept that my company will pay me into my bank account. Surely that's empowering the banks. Is there a way to stop that, or as a people, as a sort of movement, could we stop that?
Well, there are 2 or 3 banking systems out on the internet at the moment where you can pay in and whatever, and it's entirely free. People confuse the bank on the high street with the kind of banking that we're talking about, where all the frauds and stuff are going on. Yes, you could have a bank on the high street where you're paid into and you can go in and draw it out and blah, blah, blah. We all need that functionality. And that was literally within 3 hours of being shut off when the credit crunch happened.
Why is it so different now for 20, 25, 30 years ago, when I remember my father coming home for his weekly work and he had a brown envelope and cash in that envelope? There was no bank accounts, or maybe there was, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. Why is it so different now? Why do we have to have a bank account that I get my monthly wage put into?
You don't. If there was no interest.
Yeah, but I mean, not even 90%, 100% of the people that I know that work get their money paid into their bank account at the end of the month. Why do we have to have that? Because surely that's empowering the banks. Can we not stop that?
My view would be that we live in a society now where we purchase so many goods in an electronic format. I mean, my business itself is we sell our holidays on the internet or over the phone. And it would be virtually impossible it would be impossible to operate that business if you couldn't transfer funds to me in an electronic format. We sell them around the UK, but we have a call centre in Newcastle. If everybody had to come to Newcastle to pay us cash, the business would fall down. And there are the vast majority of businesses now require or rely on electronic transfer funds. If you were to unwind that, those businesses would all have to disappear. That would mean an awful lot of redundancies in the short term. Those jobs would be replaced again by people, if you had to go down the local HMV store to buy all your CDs because you couldn't buy them on iTunes, then there'd be more people working in HMV, but then there'd be nobody working at iTunes. But it would be a major correction on the way that society has evolved, because we've evolved now in a way that we just use an electronic format to pay so many things.
I'll just come in there. You could still have an electronic system which didn't use usury and use the fractional reserve system. So what you use as money isn't really the issue. Now I'd just like to ask, with this debt money in the economy, people say, well, it's going to collapse, the whole thing's going to collapse. But as long as someone is continuing to prop it up by putting debt money into the economy so that people can then use that money to pay the interest on the debt, as long as there's a feed going in of debt, it will sustain itself forever. Now, I'm going to ask a bit of a conspiracy question here. Is it possible for those who control the monetary system to reclaim that debt and collapse the system like that? Could they do that tomorrow? And then perhaps move us to a one world currency? Do you think that that's
exactly
the purpose of inflating the economy, to crash it and then one world currency? Would you?
Yes,
elaborate on that?
it's not even that they want one world currency, it's just that they want control over it. I mean, Portugal at the minute, is it Portugal? It's about to go under. They need a loan from the IMF, from Europe, just to keep them going. Sorry? Yeah. What's happening here is a coup, and it's under the disguise of Europe. It's such a big story behind this. It's not the platform to go into it, but again, in the audience earlier, I did hear someone saying that actually the people that lie behind this are Nazis. Yes, they are. They did not lose World War II. Germany did. And this is going on and on. Now, I know that's a profound link to make, but in 1910, the Eugenics Record Office established a branch at the Galton National Library in London. It was endowed by the Harriman family, which along with the Rockefellers gave Prescott Bush his start in politics. This is the guy who funded Hitler and was pulled up for it and prosecuted afterwards. He provided more than 11 million to create the Eugenics Record Office. Do you know who the first director of that Eugenics Office was in 1912? Winston Churchill. It's ironic that years later he went to war against the supposed Nazis. There's a much bigger picture going on, and you're literally being fed a movie at the moment.
So, Steve, do you look at the theories that there are people moving pieces on a chessboard saying, right, well, we're probably going to move to a one world currency at this point by collapsing the economy? Do you think along those lines, or I mean, your business line?
I would suspect not. I think the difficulty of doing what Mark suggests is to go and get rid of the fractional reserve system overnight, is that if you look at the pain that everybody's enduring already I think they've tweaked the system on the fractional reserve system where the banks, rather than having to hold, I think they used to have to hold about 5% of the money they were lending out as reserves, they've increased it to 7%. And the pain that's causing, if you suddenly said, actually, you've got to hold 100% of your money in reserves, that would mean nobody would be able to borrow any money probably for a period of 10 to 12 years, which would mean house prices would absolutely collapse. Nobody would be able to set a business up. No matter how good an idea they had, it could be a surefire bet, because the banks would have to use all of the money going into them to basically eliminate the fractional reserve.
But you're still including the banks in the system there, and I'm not. That's the point.
Could that money not be created some other way by a central source at no interest? I mean, this is the debate we're having.
It's not a debate. It's either that works and the system doesn't work at the minute. And Steve's rightly he is rightly pointing out that there's going to be a lot of pain, whatever changes you make. But part of the plan that is unfolding before you now involves you going through a hell of a lot more pain than you're suffering at the minute, because it's not even begun in this country. Look around you now and see what's actually happening. It's coming here, and it's coming here soon.
Richard, is it not fair to look at and understand the House of Rothschild, and then everything will become clear? If you look into the stuff that other people have been talking about, because everybody seems to have ideas about, we're arguing about what's going to happen, but if you look at their history and understand what the name Rothschild means and the history of it and what they've created over a period, then it will all come clear to everyone. This chap's talking about what can you do. The whole thing is going to collapse, there's no doubt about it, but it's understanding the history of it. And when you look at that, then it will all become clear.
But they will never tell you that history.
But people like yourself have to go out there. You're doing it.
Well,
we have to see and understand
one
it.
comment on that.
Yep.
The Rothschilds, as we know, control a great deal of the world's banking, but they also control a great deal of the world's media, which is why what we're discussing now never gets in the
The only
media.
person I've heard discussing this in any great detail has been David Icke.
Well, exactly.
And he's regarded as a nutter.
Yeah, but this is because the Rothschilds control the media and they wouldn't allow this debate.
Yeah, but situations like this is allowing it to happen now.
But when it does become public knowledge, imagine it was on Newsnight tomorrow night, right? 80-90% of the British public will be more concerned about who's on the Jeremy bloody what's his name show the next day. So it's not actually.
The pain's going to happen anyway. It's going to be
So
like what you're saying.
what I have suggested for a long time is that it has. You can't educate all of the public, and this isn't for everybody. It really isn't, and we've got to wake up
But
to
you
that.
could argue
It's
that
not
it is
an
because
intellectual
everybody's going to
thing.
be affected over time.
That's it. What has to happen is those who do understand it, and when you do understand this simple thing, you will realise that it's probably the biggest crime against humanity, quite literally, because it creates poverty. That's what it does globally, literally. But it can be solved by the very thing you're talking about, sir.
There's a thing online, it's probably going to disappear, or it has disappeared. It's a thing called modern money mechanics that the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve wrote about 100 years ago that you won't be able to find very soon. And if
Basel
people were to
III.
look at that, then they would understand where it comes from.
The banking coup that's taking place will end, as far as they're concerned, with Basel III in November of this year. I think it's November. Basel II, this is the banking conference where they get together and decide the system itself. Basel II, incidentally, was based entirely on that copula formula I showed you earlier. That's, so it was completely flawed from the start. The answer to the question, as far as I've always been concerned, is for the people who do understand to actually go out there and do something about it in a way that will attract the attention of those who haven't got a clue what's going on. Now, and I have suggested that enough people, literally, because they're always squaring the circle. This square mile in London is where this thing stems from. They square the circle. You have your Freemasons, you have your secret societies. The knowledge which allows them to set up the banking system the way it's been done comes from those secret societies. It goes right back to the temples of thousands of years ago even. But it's quite definable nowadays. If the people get off their arses in this country and go and encircle the square mile in London and refuse to give the damn thing back until someone from government comes out and answers a simple question. Why do you allow our currency to be issued by a private group of individuals as a debt with interest when tomorrow we can choose to have it debt-free issued by ourselves?
But the only way you're going to get around that is if you look at the House of Rothschild and people understand where it's coming from, then then you can see it. It's clear as day.
Exactly.
When
It
you
is
see
clear
that.
to anyone who looks. You've got to make them want to look and say,
Yeah.
what's going on here? Because the second you look, it's like, whoa.
Many people ask this question about the Bank of England. We just come on to the ownership of it. I mean, is this something that concerns you, Steve, at all? I mean, like, is it owned by private shareholders, or is it owned by the government, or is it owned by the Queen or the Rothschilds? Does that matter?
My understanding is the Bank of England is effectively a quango, so it's a non-governmental organisation, but it's owned by the people. I don't think it has private. To my understanding, there's no private shareholders of the Bank of England.
Well, there are.
And it has,
Yeah, there are. That's why in 1977 they set up the Bank of England Nominees Limited. It's a private limited
Sorry,
company.
what year amount was that?
77.
Right.
And if you look in the Bank of England accounts today, it shows you payments to shareholders. So how can a nationalised industry have shareholders? Do you see what I mean? But most people won't stop to question that. And when someone does explain to them that actually it's a crime and a scam, it's like, well, what can we do about it? What can you do about it? You can do what they're doing in various countries around the world and get off our asses and actually go and do something about it, because by 2012 you'll have no option whatsoever.
Okay, thanks,
Can
Mark.
I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Because I don't know that. Who are the shareholders then?
Well, this is the great question. No one can actually define them. But in 77, when people like myself, I was just beginning to back then, but others were questioning this with the government, and the government's response was to introduce the Nominees Act, which stops, it removes, they have to declare who the owners are and so on, but under this, they're exempt.
Is it
so
not to do with the Royal Charter part
It's
of it?
entirely to do with
Apparently
Royal
because
Charter.
It was created under Royal Charter, they don't have to declare the shareholders' names. It's not like a normal company, if it is a company. I mean, I don't know. I'm not.
Well,
but I know that there's.
I'll read out. Can I read out their own
different
words?
views
Because
on
it answers the question. When it was set up, and this is a quote from the Act, it's considered undesirable that the disclosure requirement should apply to certain categories of shareholders. This is in a nationalised bank, supposedly. Shareholders. Who are they? It says quite specifically, to act as nominee or agent or attorney either solely or jointly with others for person or persons, partnership, company, corporation, government, state, sovereign, province, authority or public body. It's the Queen, or should I say, the post of the Queen, is one of the owners of the
Right.
Bank of England.
We'll be drawn to a close shortly, so really, the guy at the back with the blue shirt.
Is it the fact we have to pay interest, or is it the fact that we have to pay such high interest that causes the problems that we've got? Because the Bank of England base rate is only 0.5%, which is virtually next to nothing, yet you try to get a loan, it's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25%. Is this not the source of the problem?
It's the second. Interest is one of the problems. The problem is that somebody else, someone private, is giving money to us and lending it to us with interest. So you don't overlook the capital. The capital is always going to be the biggest element of that. So yes, it's the problem. But if we stop the issuance of the currency by a private institution and issue it ourselves, debt-free, and that means it can still be repaid. We repay the currency back to our own bank, but if you want a mortgage for a property, you go and buy it. If you want to buy a £150,000 house tomorrow, you can get a mortgage, but when you've paid that $150,000 back, that's the end of your debt. Maybe a fee would be imposed to set it up of a couple of £100 or whatever it may be.
Is that not
End of.
interest rate the same token?
No, I hear what you're saying, but that fee would be based entirely on the cost of issuing the loan.
Time for
Yeah.
one more question. The guy there had his hand up.
We're going down to governments or being controlled by a global bank, right? So basically they all borrow money from one global bank, right? As it's expected, like the Rothschilds or whoever runs it, right? Why are local governments investing the money that they get in foreign economies, taking a hit on that money, right, when it's still all coming from one global bank in the first place?
Right. I can't answer that. Either of you care to comment? It's good having
The government
two
have,
people.
I think Richard touched on it in his presentation, that a lot of the governments and a lot of the European governments are investing in bonds that are issued by each other. At certain times of the year, they, and particularly local government, depending on when they collect cash from ratepayers, etc., they sometimes have cash reserves. They try to make interest on those reserves. And one way to do that is by investing that either in bonds or shares or in extreme circumstances, Icelandic banks. They try to maximise their return on that, and obviously one of the things they do when they do that is to diversify, so that in the event of Portugal being unable to pay their debt, at least that money's being spread around. If they put all of their money into one set of bonds and that country defaulted on its debt, then clearly they would lose all their money. So they just spread their investments around with their surplus cash in order to try and earn interest themselves.
Okay, I'd like to thank the audience. You've been a fantastic audience. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mark. Really. So that's all for this week, and it just remains for me to say, keep your eyes on the skies, keep your feet on the ground, and tell all your friends about this show.